If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1, The Emperor Ascends, The Birth of a Continental Ambition. Part 1, The Coronation of an Ambitious General. The grand bells of Notre Dame Cathedral echoed across Paris on December 2, 1804, as France prepared to witness something extraordinary. Inside the ancient stone walls, where kings had once been crowned, Napoleon Bonaparte stood ready to transform himself from military commander to emperor. But this ceremony would break every tradition that had come before it. Pope Pius VII had traveled from Rome to oversee the coronation, expecting to place the crown upon Napoleon's head as Catholic tradition demanded. The gathered nobles, diplomats, and officials anticipated a conventional ceremony that would legitimize the young general's rise to power. They were about to witness something far more audacious. As the moment arrived, Napoleon stepped forward and took the crown from the Pope's hands. The cathedral fell silent. Instead of kneeling to receive the blessing of divine authority, Napoleon raised the golden crown and placed it upon his own head. The message was clear and shocking. He would bow to no earthly power, not even the church that had crowned French kings for centuries. The symbolism cut deeper than mere ceremony. By crowning himself, Napoleon declared that his authority came from his own achievements, not from God or ancient bloodlines. He had seized power through military genius and political cunning, and now he claimed the right to rule through strength alone. The revolutionary ideals of equality and republicanism, which had toppled the monarchy just 15 years earlier, lay shattered at his feet. Josephine knelt before her husband as he placed the empress's crown upon her head. The woman who had once been the wife of a revolutionary general now became the consort of an emperor. The transformation was complete, yet it represented only the beginning of Napoleon's grander vision. The ceremony marked France's official transition from republic to empire, but it signaled something far more ambitious. Napoleon had not simply restored monarchy, he had created something entirely new. This was an empire built on merit and conquest rather than birth and tradition. The Code Napoleon, which would soon reshape legal systems across Europe, embodied this new order where talent and achievement determined a person's place in society. The crowned emperor gazed out from Notre Dame at a Europe that still viewed him as an upstart general. Austria, Russia, and Britain watched nervously as France transformed itself into an imperial power under a leader who recognized no limits to his ambition. The old monarchies understood that Napoleon's self-coronation challenged their very existence. Within months of the ceremony, European capitals buzzed with diplomatic activity. Coalitions formed and reformed as traditional powers sought to contain this new emperor who had dared to crown himself. Napoleon's bold act in Notre Dame had not merely created a French empire, it had set the stage for a continental struggle that would reshape the map of Europe and determine whether the old order could survive against revolutionary imperial ambition. Part 2. The Code and the Empire. While Europe's monarchs plotted against this new emperor, Napoleon understood that military victories alone could not secure his empire. He needed something more permanent, more transformative than battlefield triumphs. The answer lay in rebuilding France from within, creating a system so effective that other nations would either adopt it willingly or face conquest by a superior model of governance. The task began with France's chaotic legal system. For centuries, the country had operated under a patchwork of contradictory laws that varied from province to province. Some regions followed ancient Roman traditions, others adhered to local customs, and still others operated under royal decrees that often conflicted with each other. Justice depended more on geography than fairness, creating confusion and resentment among citizens who never knew which rules applied to them. Napoleon assembled France's brightest legal minds to solve this problem. Working day and night, these scholars and lawyers crafted what would become the Civil Code, a comprehensive set of laws that would govern every aspect of French society. Napoleon himself attended many of these sessions, demanding clarity and practical application. He wanted laws that ordinary people could understand, not the complex Latin phrases that had dominated legal proceedings for centuries. The new code established fundamental principles that revolutionary France had promised but never fully delivered. All citizens would be equal before the law, regardless of birth or social status. Merit, not noble bloodlines, would determine advancement in government service. Property rights received strong protection, encouraging business and investment. Marriage became a civil contract rather than purely religious ceremony, while divorce became possible under specific circumstances. These changes transformed French society in ways that reached far beyond courtrooms. Government positions that had traditionally belonged to aristocratic families now opened to anyone with talent and ambition. Talented individuals from modest backgrounds could rise to positions of real authority, creating a new class of administrators loyal to Napoleon rather than to old noble families. This meritocratic system strengthened the empire by placing capable people in crucial positions. The code's influence spread rapidly beyond France's borders. As Napoleon's armies conquered new territories, they brought these legal reforms with them. Local populations often welcomed the changes, particularly the promise of equality and advancement based on ability. German states, Italian principalities, and other conquered regions found themselves operating under a rational, efficient system that replaced centuries of feudal confusion. Foreign observers recognized the code's revolutionary impact. Even nations that opposed Napoleon militarily began studying and adapting elements of his legal system. The code offered a blueprint for modern governance that addressed the practical needs of changing societies while maintaining order and stability. This legal transformation gave Napoleon something more valuable than military conquest, a model of governance that made French rule attractive to conquered peoples. When his armies arrived, they brought not just foreign domination, but genuine improvement in daily life. This combination of military power and administrative excellence would prove crucial as Napoleon prepared to challenge Britain's naval supremacy and expand his continental empire. Part 3. At war with Britain again. The peace with Britain had always been fragile. When Napoleon signed the Treaty of Amiens in March 1802, both sides knew it was merely a pause in their struggle for dominance. The ink had barely dried when tensions began rising again. Britain watched nervously as Napoleon expanded French influence in Italy and Switzerland. The British press attacked the French emperor daily, calling him a tyrant who threatened all of Europe. British merchants complained that French trade policies hurt their business. Meanwhile, Napoleon grew angry that Britain refused to hand over Malta as promised in the treaty. The breaking point came in May 1803. Britain declared war again, claiming Napoleon had violated the peace agreement. Napoleon was ready. He had spent the peaceful months building up his military and planning his next moves. Now he could pursue his most daring dream, invading Britain itself. The emperor threw himself into preparing for invasion with fierce energy. He assembled over 160,000 soldiers along the French coast, calling this force the Grande Armée. These were not the ragged revolutionary soldiers of earlier wars, but professional warriors trained to perfection. They drilled endlessly on the beaches of Boulogne, practicing loading into boats and storming imaginary English shores. Napoleon understood the key challenge: getting his army across the English Channel. The narrow stretch of water might as well have been an ocean if the British Navy controlled it. He needed to clear the channel of British ships, even for just a few days. That would be enough time to ferry his soldiers across and begin the conquest of Britain. The French emperor devised an elaborate plan to distract the British fleet. He would send his ships to different corners of the world, forcing the British to spread their forces thin. When they least expected it, his admirals would race back to concentrate in the channel, giving him the window he needed. Across the water, British leaders prepared desperately for invasion. They built signal towers along the coast to warn of approaching French ships. Volunteer militias trained with pitchforks and hunting rifles. The government printed millions of pounds in banknotes and prepared to evacuate the royal family if necessary. This rivalry consumed both nations completely. Napoleon spent vast sums building invasion barges and training his army. Britain poured money into subsidizing European allies who might attack France from behind. The conflict shaped every decision both leaders made about trade, diplomacy, and military strategy. The invasion preparations revealed something crucial about Napoleon's character. He believed completely in his ability to achieve the impossible. While others saw the Channel as an insurmountable barrier, he saw it as merely another obstacle to overcome through careful planning and superior force. As 1804 turned into 1805, the Emperor's invasion force stood ready. The fate of two empires hung on whether Napoleon could master the waters that had protected Britain for centuries. Part 4. Austerlitz. The son of Napoleon rises. The invasion fleet gathered at Boulogne faced an unexpected problem in late 1805. Austria and Russia had formed a new coalition with Britain, threatening France from the east. Napoleon realized he could not fight wars on two fronts simultaneously. In a brilliant strategic pivot, he abandoned his Channel crossing plans and marched his Grande Armée eastward toward the Austrian frontier. The Austrian forces, led by General Mack, positioned themselves at Ulm, believing they could block French advances into their territory. Napoleon had other plans. He moved his army with incredible speed, covering vast distances in just weeks. His soldiers, hardened by months of invasion training, marched through Bavaria and surrounded Ulm before the Austrians fully understood what was happening. General Mack found himself trapped with 30,000 men and no escape route. The French emperor offered generous surrender terms, and the Austrian commander accepted defeat without a major battle. This stunning victory eliminated one entire enemy army before the real fighting even began. But a larger threat loomed. Tsar Alexander of Russia was marching west with 90,000 troops to join the remaining Austrian forces under Emperor Francis. The combined Russian-Austrian army would vastly outnumber Napoleon's forces. Many French generals urged caution, suggesting defensive positions or even retreat. Napoleon chose the opposite approach. He deliberately weakened his apparent position near the village of Austerlitz, making his army look vulnerable and divided. He abandoned the strong heights of Pratzen Plateau, allowing enemy scouts to observe what seemed like French confusion and retreat. The Allied commanders took the bait completely. They developed an ambitious plan to attack what they believed was Napoleon's weak right flank, expecting to crush the French army in a single decisive assault. Both emperors, Alexander and Francis, rode with their troops, confident of victory against the upstart French emperor. December 2nd, 1805, dawned cold and foggy. The anniversary of Napoleon's coronation would become his greatest battlefield triumph. As the Russian and Austrian forces descended from the heights to attack his supposedly weak positions, Napoleon sprang his trap. He sent Marshal Soult's corps charging up the abandoned Pratzen Heights, splitting the Allied army in half. The fog lifted just as French cannons opened fire from the commanding position. Russian and Austrian soldiers found themselves caught in deadly crossfire, unable to coordinate their attacks or retreat effectively. Napoleon had turned their own strategy against them, using their advance to expose their flanks and break their formations. The battle raged for hours, but the outcome was never truly in doubt once the French occupied the heights. Entire enemy regiments surrendered or fled in panic. By evening, the coalition had lost 27,000 men, while French casualties numbered only 9,000. Emperor Francis requested an immediate armistice. Austria signed the Treaty of Pressburg weeks later, ceding vast territories and paying enormous indemnities. The Holy Roman Empire officially ended, replaced by Napoleon's vision of a new European order. The victory at Austerlitz established Napoleon as the dominant military genius of his age and convinced him that no coalition could withstand his strategic brilliance. Part 5. Tilsit and the Carving of Europe. The victory at Austerlitz had shattered one coalition, but Napoleon's appetite for conquest had only grown stronger. Within months, Prussia made the fatal mistake of challenging French dominance. The Prussians had watched Austria's humiliation with growing alarm and finally declared war in 1806. Napoleon responded with characteristic speed and fury. The Prussian army, once the terror of Europe under Frederick the Great, had grown complacent and outdated. At Jena and Auerstedt, fought on the same day in October 1806, Napoleon's forces obliterated two separate Prussian armies. The twin victories were so complete that Prussian resistance collapsed overnight. Napoleon marched triumphantly into Berlin, standing before Frederick's tomb and reportedly saying to his marshals that they would not be here if the great king still lived. But Prussia's ally Russia remained defiant. Tsar Alexander I had no intention of accepting French dominance over Europe. Through the bitter winter of 1806 to 1807, French and Russian forces clashed across the frozen landscapes of East Prussia. The battles were brutal and inconclusive, fought in snow and mud that claimed as many lives as enemy bullets. Everything changed at Friedland in June 1807. Napoleon caught the Russian army in a vulnerable position and delivered a crushing defeat that cost Alexander 20,000 casualties. The Tsar, watching his armies crumble and his treasury empty, finally requested peace negotiations. What followed was one of history's most extraordinary diplomatic encounters. Napoleon and Alexander met on a raft anchored in the middle of the Niemen River, symbolically between French and Russian territory. The two emperors, both young and ambitious, spent hours in private conversation while their armies watched from opposite banks. Napoleon deployed all his legendary charm, treating Alexander as an equal and painting visions of joint dominion over Europe. The Treaty of Tilsit that emerged from these talks reshaped the continent. Prussia lost half its territory, including all lands west of the Elbe River. Napoleon created the Duchy of Warsaw from Prussian Poland, a client state that would serve French interests. More dramatically, he forged an alliance with Russia that divided Europe into spheres of influence. Alexander agreed to join Napoleon's Continental system, the economic blockade designed to strangle British trade. In return, Russia received a free hand in Finland and assurance that Napoleon would support Russian expansion toward Constantinople. The two emperors even discussed dividing the Ottoman Empire between themselves. King Frederick William of Prussia, reduced to a powerless spectator, watched his kingdom carved up like a feast. The proud Prussian state that had challenged France now survived only through French mercy. The psychological impact was devastating, but it would ultimately forge a steel-hard determination for revenge. Napoleon's diplomatic triumph at Tilsit represented the peak of his European dominance. From Spain to Poland, French influence now stretched across the continent. Client kingdoms and puppet states bowed to his will. Yet the very success that seemed to secure his empire also planted the seeds of its destruction. The humiliated powers would remember every slight, every lost province, every moment of forced submission. Chapter 2. The Empire at Zenith. Glory, Expansion, and Overreach. Part 1. The Continental System and the Economic War. By 1806, Napoleon had crushed every major European power, except one that remained stubbornly out of reach. Britain sat protected behind its navy, controlling the seas and funding every coalition against France. Traditional military conquest seemed impossible against an island nation with the world's strongest fleet. Napoleon needed a different weapon. The emperor conceived an economic stranglehold that would bring Britain to its knees without firing a single shot. In November 1806, he issued the Berlin Decree, declaring a complete blockade of British goods across all territories under French control or influence. No British ships could enter continental ports. No British products could be sold or bought. Napoleon called this his Continental System, and it would transform Europe into one massive weapon aimed at Britain's wallet. The logic appeared sound. Britain depended entirely on trade for survival. Its factories needed continental markets to sell manufactured goods. Its people needed imported food to eat. Cut these lifelines, Napoleon reasoned, and Britain would collapse from within. The Royal Navy might rule the waves, but France controlled the continent. Initially, the system showed promise. British exports dropped sharply. Unemployment rose in manufacturing centers like Manchester and Birmingham. Some British merchants faced bankruptcy as their traditional markets vanished overnight. Napoleon watched with satisfaction as his economic war began to bite. However, the Continental System demanded total cooperation from every European nation, and this requirement created immediate problems. Neutral countries like Denmark and Portugal found themselves forced to choose sides. Russia, despite being Napoleon's ally, watched its grain exports to Britain disappear, crushing Russian landowners who depended on British gold. The human cost mounted quickly across Europe. French consumers discovered that British goods had no easy replacements. Coffee, sugar, and cotton became luxury items. Smuggling networks sprang up everywhere, creating a shadow economy that enriched criminals while impoverishing legitimate merchants. German states saw their traditional trade routes disrupted, causing widespread economic hardship. Local resistance emerged as communities watched their livelihoods disappear. Portuguese merchants ignored the decree, knowing their survival depended on British trade. Dutch businessmen found creative ways around the restrictions. Even French citizens began to resent a policy that raised prices and reduced choices in their daily lives. Napoleon faced an impossible dilemma. Enforcing the Continental System required constant military pressure on reluctant allies. Resources that could have strengthened the empire instead went toward policing trade routes and crushing economic dissent. The emperor found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts, not against armies, but against the natural flow of commerce itself. The system that was meant to be Napoleon's masterstroke slowly became his burden, creating resentment among allies and exposing the limits of French power. Part 2. The Spanish Quagmire, Birth of the Peninsular War. The burden of enforcing the Continental System had already strained French resources, but Napoleon's next decision would prove even more catastrophic. In 1807, the emperor turned his attention to Spain, a nation that seemed ripe for French control. The Spanish royal family was divided and weak, with King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand locked in bitter conflict. Napoleon saw opportunity in this chaos. French troops marched into Spain under the pretense of supporting their ally against Portugal. Spanish officials welcomed the soldiers, believing they came as friends. Napoleon had different plans. In May 1808, he summoned both Spanish kings to Bayonne, France, where he forced them to give up their throne. The emperor then placed his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, believing the Spanish people would accept this arrangement as they had in other conquered territories. Napoleon badly misjudged the Spanish character. Unlike other European nobles who had bent to French will, ordinary Spanish citizens exploded in rage. On May 2, 1808, Madrid erupted in violent rebellion. Spanish fighters attacked French soldiers with knives, stones, and whatever weapons they could find. French troops responded with brutal executions that only fueled more anger. The rebellion spread like wildfire across the Spanish countryside. Spanish fighters discovered they could not defeat French armies in open battle, so they developed new tactics. Small groups of guerrillas struck French supply lines, ambushed isolated patrols, and melted back into the population. They called this warfare the Little War. Guerrilla in Spanish. These hit-and-run attacks drove French commanders to desperation. They could win every major battle, yet never control the country. Spanish fighters knew every mountain path and village hiding place. Local priests blessed the resistance, turning the conflict into a religious crusade against foreign invaders. Napoleon poured more troops into Spain, but the country devoured his armies like quicksand. By 1810, over 300,000 French soldiers were trapped, fighting an enemy they could never pin down. These were veteran troops desperately needed elsewhere in Europe. The Spanish War became a bleeding wound that weakened the entire French Empire. The conflict also shattered Napoleon's reputation. Stories of Spanish resistance spread across Europe, proving that French armies could be fought and frustrated. German intellectuals wrote pamphlets praising Spanish courage. Austrian generals studied guerrilla tactics. For the first time, Napoleon appeared not as an unstoppable conqueror, but as a fallible leader trapped in an endless war. The Peninsular War revealed a fatal flaw in Napoleon's empire. While he could defeat kings and armies, he could not conquer the will of an entire people determined to resist. The Spanish Quagmire would drain French strength for 6 years, creating the conditions for even greater disasters to come. Part 3. The Marriage of an Emperor. By 1809, with Spain bleeding French resources and European resistance growing, Napoleon faced a personal crisis that threatened his empire's future. He had no legitimate heir. His marriage to Josephine, though passionate, had produced no children. The emperor who controlled much of Europe could not secure his own dynasty. The solution came through cold political calculation. Napoleon decided to divorce Josephine and marry into European royalty. His choice shocked the continent. Marie-Louise, daughter of Austrian Emperor Francis I. This was the same Austria that had fought Napoleon for years, the nation whose armies he had crushed at Austerlitz. The marriage proposal revealed Napoleon's growing need for acceptance among Europe's royal families. He wanted to transform himself from a Corsican upstart into legitimate royalty. By marrying Habsburg blood, he hoped to silence critics who saw him as merely a successful soldier playing at being emperor. For Austria, the marriage offered a path to peace. Francis I had watched his armies suffer defeat after defeat. His daughter's marriage to Napoleon might buy Austria time to rebuild while keeping his former enemy satisfied. The Austrian court agreed, though Marie-Louise herself had little choice in the matter. The wedding ceremony in April 1810 displayed Napoleon's power at its peak. European royalty gathered in Paris to witness the union. The same kings who had once sworn to destroy Napoleon now smiled and offered congratulations. The marriage seemed to prove that even the oldest European dynasties accepted his rule. Marie-Louise adapted to her role as French empress, and within a year, she gave Napoleon what he desperately wanted: a son. The birth of Napoleon II in March 1811 secured the dynasty. The emperor finally had an heir bearing both Bonaparte and Habsburg blood. European courts could no longer dismiss Napoleon as a temporary phenomenon. The marriage changed European diplomacy fundamentally. Austria became France's reluctant ally. Other nations watched nervously as two former enemies joined forces. Prussia and Russia wondered if Napoleon had gained too much strength through this union. The balance of power that had kept Europe stable for centuries seemed permanently altered. Yet the marriage also revealed Napoleon's growing isolation from reality. While he celebrated his dynastic success, the Spanish War continued draining French strength. His new alliance with Austria came at the cost of Russian friendship. Tsar Alexander watched Napoleon's growing power with increasing alarm. The emperor's personal triumph masked deeper problems within his empire. Marriage to Marie-Louise gave Napoleon legitimacy and an heir, but it could not solve the fundamental issues that threatened his rule. Economic strain from the Continental system continued. Spanish resistance showed no signs of ending. European nationalism grew stronger each year. Napoleon had achieved his personal goals through this strategic marriage, but in doing so, he had also planted seeds of future conflict. The union that was meant to secure his empire would eventually contribute to the coalition that would destroy it. Part 4. Resistance and uprising across Europe. While Napoleon celebrated his marriage and the birth of his heir, trouble brewed in the furthest corners of his empire. The Continental system had created widespread hardship, and the Spanish War had shown that the French army was not invincible. Across Europe, people began to realize they could resist the emperor's rule. In the mountains of Tyrol, Andreas Hofer led Austrian peasants against French occupation forces. These mountain fighters knew every valley and pass, making life miserable for Napoleon's soldiers. They struck quickly and disappeared into the rugged terrain, forcing the French to maintain large garrisons just to hold basic territory. Hofer became a folk hero, proving that ordinary people could challenge the mighty French war machine. Portugal remained a constant source of frustration. Despite multiple French invasions, the Portuguese people refused to accept Bonaparte's rule. They received British support through the Royal Navy, but their own fierce resistance made the difference. Villages that appeared calm during the day turned hostile at night. French messengers disappeared on mountain roads. Supply convoys faced constant attacks. In Germany, the situation grew more complex. Napoleon had reorganized the German states, dissolving the old Holy Roman Empire and creating new kingdoms loyal to France. But this very act awakened something dangerous for the emperor. German intellectuals and students began talking about a unified German nation. They studied their own history and culture, developing pride in being German rather than just Prussian or Bavarian. Secret societies formed throughout German universities. Young men read forbidden books about liberty and national independence. They watched the Spanish fight the French and wondered why Germans could not do the same. The French occupation had accidentally created the very nationalism that would eventually destroy Napoleon's empire. These resistance movements shared common themes. Local traditions mattered more than French laws. Religious faith provided strength against foreign rulers. Stories of past glory inspired hope for future freedom. Each uprising taught valuable lessons to other regions under French control. Napoleon's administrators sent increasingly worried reports to Paris. Governing hostile populations required enormous resources. Troops needed to maintain order could not fight in major campaigns. The emperor's attention was constantly divided between new conquests and rebellious territories. The emperor dismissed these problems as temporary setbacks. His generals assured him that firm action would restore order. But the pattern was clear to those who looked carefully. Napoleon could win battles and occupy capitals, but he could not win the hearts of conquered peoples. Each rebellion weakened the empire's foundation. Resources flowed towards suppressing revolts rather than building strength for future wars. The myth of French invincibility cracked with every successful guerrilla attack. European rulers watched these developments with growing interest, calculating when they might safely challenge Bonaparte again. The stage was set for larger conflicts ahead. Part 5. The Myth of Invincibility. By 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte seemed unstoppable. His armies had crushed Austria, Prussia, and Russia. French eagles flew over most of Europe. Court artists painted glorious battle scenes, while writers composed heroic poems about the emperor's victories. This constant stream of propaganda created a dangerous myth that Napoleon could never lose. The emperor himself believed his own legend. He spoke confidently of his military genius and dismissed his enemies as weak and outdated. His marshals echoed these beliefs, afraid to contradict their master. Palace courtiers competed to praise Napoleon's brilliance. This echo chamber reinforced the dangerous idea that French victory was inevitable. Victory after victory had trained Napoleon's mind to expect success. At Austerlitz, he had destroyed the combined armies of Austria and Russia. At Jena, he had humiliated Prussia in a single day. At Wagram, he had forced Austria to surrender yet again. These triumphs created a pattern of thinking where defeat seemed impossible. But cracks were already showing in the empire's foundation. The Spanish guerrillas continued their bloody resistance despite repeated French victories in pitched battles. Portuguese peasants harassed French supply lines even after their armies had fled. German intellectuals whispered about freedom and national honor in university halls and coffeehouses. Napoleon's inner circle chose to ignore these warning signs. When reports arrived about growing unrest in occupied territories, officials minimized their importance. They focused instead on French military strength and enemy weakness. This selective vision prevented crucial information from reaching the emperor's attention. The Continental system was failing badly, but Napoleon refused to admit it. British goods still flowed into European markets through smuggling networks. French merchants complained about lost profits, but the emperor blamed their lack of patriotism. He could not see that his economic war was hurting France more than Britain. Russian Tsar Alexander's growing independence troubled some French diplomats, but Napoleon dismissed their concerns. He believed one more decisive victory would bring Alexander back into line. The idea that Russia might successfully resist French power seemed absurd to someone who had conquered so much of Europe. This overconfidence led to increasingly reckless decisions. Napoleon began planning campaigns based on past successes rather than current realities. He assumed enemies would behave exactly as they had before. The possibility that they might learn from previous defeats and adapt their strategies never seriously entered his calculations. The myth of invincibility had become Napoleon's greatest weakness. It blinded him to real dangers and made him underestimate opponents who were growing stronger and more determined. The empire stood at its greatest extent, but the emperor's judgment was becoming dangerously flawed. The very confidence that had carried him to unprecedented heights would soon lead him toward catastrophic miscalculations that would shake the foundations of his entire empire. Chapter 3: The Empire Strikes the East. The Russian Catastrophe. Part 1. The Fatal March to Moscow. In the winter of 1812, Napoleon stood at the height of his power, master of an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland. Yet the Russian Tsar Alexander refused to bend the knee, continuing to trade with Britain and defying the continental system that was meant to strangle French enemies. For Napoleon, this defiance could not stand. Russia had to be crushed, and crushed completely. The emperor began assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Grande Armée swelled to over 600,000 men, drawing soldiers from across his empire. French veterans marched alongside reluctant Austrians, Prussians forced into service, and eager Polish volunteers who dreamed of independence. This massive force represented nearly every corner of Napoleon's domain, a testament to both his power and his desperate need to make Russia submit. Napoleon's plan seemed simple enough. He would march into Russia, force a decisive battle near the border, and dictate terms from a position of strength. The Russians would have no choice but to accept his demands. What could go wrong when facing such overwhelming numbers? The emperor had conquered Austria, Prussia, and half of Europe with far smaller armies. Yet problems appeared almost immediately. The sheer size of the army created nightmares no general had faced before. Feeding 600,000 men required thousands of wagons, tens of thousands of horses, and supply lines stretching back hundreds of miles. The roads of Eastern Europe, little more than dirt tracks in many places, turned to mud under the weight of this enormous host. As the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory in June 1812, the heat proved unexpectedly brutal. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Horses died by the thousands, and supply wagons broke down on primitive loads. Worse still, the Russians refused to fight. Instead of offering the decisive battle Napoleon craved, they retreated deeper into their vast homeland, taking everything useful with them. The French found empty villages and poisoned wells. Granaries stood burned, livestock driven away or slaughtered. This was not the war Napoleon knew how to fight. Each mile forward meant another mile of supply line to protect, another day without the crushing victory that would bring Alexander to his knees. Disease began to ravage the ranks. Dysentery and typhus spread through camps where sanitation collapsed under the pressure of feeding and housing such massive numbers. Soldiers who had marched proudly across the Niemen now struggled just to keep up with their units. The great army that was meant to terrify Russia was slowly consuming itself. Yet Napoleon pressed forward, convinced that one more march, one decisive engagement, would end this campaign as quickly as all his others. He had no way of knowing that the real enemy was not the Russian army retreating before him, but the land itself, vast and pitiless, that would soon swallow his dreams of empire whole. Part 2. The Scorched Earth and the Illusion of Control. The vast Russian countryside stretched endlessly before the French army, but it offered nothing. Where Napoleon's forces expected to find food, they discovered empty barns. Where they hoped for shelter, they found burned villages with only charred timbers and ash. The Russians had made a calculated decision that would cost them dearly but would devastate their enemies even more. General Mikhail Kutuzov and his commanders had chosen to give up their own land rather than let the French use it. Every village the Russian army abandoned became a torch. Grain stores went up in flames. Livestock was driven away or slaughtered. Wells were filled with debris or poisoned. The retreating Russians left behind a wasteland that could support no army. This strategy hit the French soldiers like a physical blow. They had marched into Russia, expecting to live off the land as they had done in Germany, Austria, and Poland. Instead, they found themselves in a country that seemed determined to starve them. The psychological effect was immediate and crushing. Soldiers who had conquered half of Europe now scrounged for scraps like beggars. Napoleon watched his iron discipline crumble day by day. Hungry men abandoned their units to search for food. Some never returned, lost in the endless forests or killed by Russian peasants who showed no mercy to stragglers. Others came back empty-handed, demoralized and increasingly desperate. The emperor who had built his reputation on perfect organization found himself commanding an army that grew more chaotic with each passing day. The breakdown began with small acts of desperation, but quickly spread through the ranks. Soldiers started hoarding whatever food they found, refusing to share with their comrades. Officers lost the respect of their men when they could not provide basic necessities. Entire regiments began to dissolve as men simply walked away from their posts, heading west toward home. Napoleon's famous attention to detail, which had won him so many battles, became useless against an enemy he could not see or fight. He issued orders, but they meant nothing to soldiers who had not eaten in days. He planned brilliant maneuvers, but his troops were too weak to execute them. The emperor who had controlled the destiny of nations found himself powerless against hunger and exhaustion. The Russian strategy was working exactly as intended. Every day the French army grew weaker while the Russian forces remained intact, always just out of reach. The scorched earth policy had turned Napoleon's greatest strength, his ability to move fast and strike hard, into a fatal weakness. His army was consuming itself in a land that offered nothing but emptiness. As summer turned toward autumn, Napoleon finally understood the trap closing around him. The Russians would not fight the decisive battle he needed. They would continue retreating, burning everything behind them, until his magnificent army withered away. Yet he pushed forward toward Moscow, still believing that capturing the ancient capital would somehow force the Russians to surrender and end this nightmare of his own making. Part 3. The Battle of Borodino, Pyrrhic Glory. September 7, 1812, dawned gray and cold near the village of Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow. Napoleon finally had what he desperately wanted, a massive Russian army standing and ready to fight. General Kutuzov, the grizzled Russian commander, had chosen this ground carefully. His 120,000 men stretched across rolling hills dotted with earthworks and wooden fortifications. Napoleon faced them with 130,000 soldiers of his Grande Armée, but these were not the same troops who had conquered Europe. Months of marching through empty Russian lands had left them hungry, tired, and far from home. The battle began before dawn, with French cannons roaring across the misty fields. Napoleon's plan was simple: smash through the Russian center and destroy their army completely. But the Russians had learned from their defeats. They built massive earthwork fortresses called redoubts that could absorb tremendous punishment. The largest, called the Great Redoubt, bristled with cannons and held thousands of determined defenders. Wave after wave of French soldiers charged the Russian positions. The sound of muskets and cannons was deafening. Men fell by the thousands as both sides poured everything into the fight. Napoleon's marshals begged for permission to commit the Imperial Guard, his elite reserve troops, but something held the emperor back. Perhaps he sensed this battle would not end the war as he hoped. By afternoon, French blood and courage had captured most Russian positions, including the Great Redoubt. The field was carpeted with bodies: 45,000 Russian casualties and 35,000 French. Napoleon could claim victory, but it felt hollow. The Russian army had not collapsed. Instead, Kutuzov ordered a fighting retreat, keeping his forces intact. The emperor had won the battlefield, but lost something far more precious: soldiers he could never replace. Standing among the carnage, Napoleon must have realized the terrible mathematics of this campaign. Each mile deeper into Russia cost him men he desperately needed. The Russians could afford these losses on their own soil, surrounded by reinforcements and supplies. He could not. His army was an island in an ocean of hostile territory, growing smaller with each passing day. The victory at Borodino opened the road to Moscow, but it also sealed Napoleon's fate. He had gained a field of corpses and lost the strength to hold what he conquered. The Russian army remained dangerous and defiant. Winter was coming, and his supply lines stretched impossibly thin across 1,000 miles of devastated countryside. As his battered soldiers limped toward Moscow, Napoleon had won his most costly victory and taken his most decisive step toward disaster. Part 4. The Fall of Moscow and the Long Retreat. Moscow lay empty when Napoleon arrived in September 1812. The French emperor had expected to find a bustling capital filled with nobles begging for peace. Instead, he found abandoned streets and shuttered buildings. The city's governor had ordered the population to evacuate, leaving behind only criminals and the desperately poor. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin for surrender negotiations that never came. Within hours of the French occupation, fires began breaking out across the city. The blazes spread quickly through Moscow's wooden structures, consuming entire neighborhoods. Whether the fires were set deliberately by retreating Russians or started by accident remains debated, but the result was catastrophic. For 3 days, Napoleon watched from his palace windows as his prize burned around him. The smoke-filled air made breathing difficult, and ash fell like snow on his soldiers. The emperor faced a terrible choice. He could not stay in a ruined city through the Russian winter, yet retreat would signal failure to all of Europe. For 5 weeks, he delayed his decision, hoping Tsar Alexander would negotiate. The Russian ruler remained silent. Every day that passed made Napoleon's position worse as winter approached and his supply lines grew thinner. On October 19th, Napoleon finally ordered the retreat. His Grande Armée, now reduced to about 100,000 men, began the long march home. The first snows fell early that year, catching the soldiers unprepared. Most had no winter clothing, expecting to be back in France by autumn. The temperature dropped steadily as they retraced their path through the devastated countryside. The retreat became a nightmare of suffering. Soldiers abandoned their weapons to walk faster. Horses died by the thousands, leaving behind artillery and wagons filled with supplies. Men fought over scraps of food and strips of leather to chew. Discipline collapsed as units scattered and regiments melted away into struggling bands of survivors. Russian cavalry harassed the retreating columns daily, picking off stragglers and capturing supply convoys. Cossack raids turned every river crossing into a deadly obstacle. The French army that had once conquered Europe was reduced to a mob of desperate refugees stumbling through the snow. The crossing of the Borodino River in November marked the final disaster. Napoleon managed to escape with a small guard, but thousands more perished in the icy waters or fell to Russian attacks. Of the 600,000 men who had marched into Russia 6 months earlier, fewer than 30,000 combat-ready soldiers made it back to France. The Russian catastrophe shattered Napoleon's reputation forever. European rulers who had feared him for over a decade suddenly saw him as vulnerable. The myth of French invincibility died in the Russian snows, and with it, the foundation of Napoleon's empire began to crack. Coalition armies were already gathering to exploit his weakness. Part 5. The collapse of the myth. The news of Napoleon's Russian disaster spread across Europe like wildfire. Diplomats who had once trembled at the mention of his name now whispered excitedly in palace corridors. The man who had seemed unstoppable for over a decade had just lost the largest army in European history. Kings and emperors who had bent the knee to French power suddenly found their courage returning. In Vienna, Austrian Chancellor Metternich received detailed reports of the retreat with barely concealed satisfaction. The same Napoleon who had humiliated Austria at Austerlitz now limped back to Paris with a fraction of his forces. Metternich began secret negotiations with Russia, sensing the perfect moment to strike back at French domination. King Frederick William III of Prussia, who had watched his kingdom shrink under Napoleon's boot, saw opportunity in the frozen corpses littering the Russian plains. For years, Prussian generals had burned with shame over their defeats. Now they whispered of revenge, of reclaiming their lost territories and honor. The disaster had created a vacuum that ambitious enemies rushed to fill. Tsar Alexander recognized the moment's importance immediately. His armies had not just defeated Napoleon. They had destroyed the myth that made him powerful. The French emperor's greatest weapon had never been his cannons or cavalry, but the belief that he could not lose. That belief lay buried in Russian snow alongside 500,000 soldiers. Napoleon himself understood the gravity of his situation. Back in Paris, he worked frantically to rebuild his forces, but something fundamental had changed. His marshals questioned orders they once followed without hesitation. His allies wavered in their commitment. A magnetic confidence that had drawn men to follow him across continents had cracked. European newspapers, once censored and fearful, began publishing accounts of French defeat. Stories spread of the mighty Grande Armée reduced to starving bands of deserters. Common soldiers across Europe, who had feared French military might, began to believe their own armies could match Napoleon's reduced forces. The coalition that formed against Napoleon differed from previous alliances in crucial ways. Earlier coalitions had been driven by fear and defensive necessity. This new alliance smelled blood in the water. Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain sensed that Napoleon's weakness might be permanent rather than temporary. By spring 1813, armies were marching from multiple directions toward French-controlled territory. The Russian campaign had not just cost Napoleon soldiers and supplies. It had cost him the aura of inevitability that had kept his enemies divided and hesitant. Now they moved with coordinated purpose, believing for the first time in years that the French Empire could actually be defeated. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility had died in the Russian winter, and with it, the psychological foundation of his entire empire began to crumble. Chapter 4: The Empire in Twilight. From Leipzig to Waterloo. Part 1: The Nation's Rise. The War of the Sixth Coalition. The year 1813 marked the beginning of Napoleon's greatest challenge as Europe's monarchs finally found common ground in their shared fear of French dominance. After Napoleon's disastrous retreat from Moscow the previous winter, the smell of weakness drew enemies like wolves to wounded prey. Russia, still smarting from years of humiliation, became the first to break ranks with France in February 1813. Frederick William III of Prussia had watched his kingdom reduced to a French puppet state for too long. The destruction of Napoleon's grand army in the Russian snows gave him the courage he desperately needed. When General York signed the Convention of Tauroggen without royal permission, effectively switching sides, the Prussian king faced a moment that would define his reign. He could punish York for treason or embrace this act of defiance against France. He chose rebellion. Russia's Tsar Alexander, still flush with victory from defending his homeland, saw opportunity where others saw risk. He pushed westward with his battle-hardened armies, knowing that Napoleon's power rested on the myth of invincibility. That myth lay shattered in the frozen corpses between Moscow and Paris. Alexander understood that this was his moment to reshape Europe's balance of power. Austria presented the most complex puzzle. Emperor Francis was Napoleon's father-in-law through Marie-Louise, yet family ties meant little when survival was at stake. Metternich, Austria's calculating foreign minister, played a dangerous game of diplomacy. He offered to mediate peace talks while secretly preparing for war. The Austrian armies began mobilizing even as Metternich smiled at French diplomats across negotiating tables. Sweden's Crown Prince Bernadotte, once Napoleon's marshal, brought intimate knowledge of French military tactics to the coalition. His betrayal stung Napoleon personally, but Bernadotte saw clearly that Napoleon's ambitions threatened every throne in Europe. Britain provided the financial backbone, pouring gold into coalition coffers while her ships strangled French trade routes. The coalition's strength lay not just in numbers, but in shared desperation. Each nation had suffered under Napoleon's boot, and each recognized that this might be their final chance to break free. Across Europe, armies began their deadly march. Prussian generals who had studied French tactics in defeat now prepared to use those lessons in victory. Napoleon still commanded respect and fear, but he faced a new reality. For the first time since his rise to power, nearly all of Europe stood united against him. The coalition armies numbered over 500,000 men, while Napoleon struggled to replace the hundreds of thousands lost in Russia. The hunter had become the hunted, and the continent held its breath as these massive forces moved toward an inevitable collision that would decide Europe's future. Part 2: The Battle of Leipzig, the Fall of a Giant. The massive armies converged on Leipzig in October 1813, transforming the Saxon city into the stage for Europe's greatest battle. Napoleon arrived with 190,000 men, but his forces were stretched thin and filled with young conscripts barely trained for war. Against him stood nearly 400,000 coalition soldiers from Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, all hungry for revenge after years of French domination. The fighting began on October 16th with thunderous artillery barrages that shook the ground for miles. Napoleon tried his old tactics, striking fast at different parts of the enemy line, hoping to break them before they could coordinate. For a moment, it seemed to work. French cavalry charged through Austrian positions, and Napoleon's artillery carved gaps in the coalition ranks. But this time, the Allies held firm. The battle stretched across 4 brutal days. Villages changed hands multiple times as soldiers fought house to house. The air filled with smoke so thick that commanders lost sight of their own units. Napoleon's young soldiers fought bravely, but they lacked the experience of his veteran Grand Armée that had conquered most of Europe. Many had never seen combat before Leipzig. On October 18th, disaster struck Napoleon's cause. His Saxon and Württemberg allies, who had fought alongside France for years, suddenly switched sides in the middle of battle. Saxon artillery that had been firing at coalition forces turned their guns on the French. Napoleon watched in horror as his own allies became his enemies, leaving gaping holes in his battle line. The betrayal sealed Napoleon's fate. With coalition forces pressing from all sides and his flanks collapsing, the French emperor ordered a retreat. But the single bridge over the Elster River created a deadly bottleneck. Thousands of French soldiers crowded toward the narrow crossing while enemy cannon fire rained down on them. In the chaos, someone accidentally destroyed the bridge while French troops were still crossing, trapping many on the wrong side. Prince Poniatowski, one of Napoleon's most loyal generals, drowned trying to swim the river in his heavy armor. Marshal MacDonald barely escaped with his life. The retreat became a rout as coalition cavalry pursued the fleeing French across the German countryside. Leipzig cost Napoleon 70,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. More importantly, it shattered the myth of French invincibility that had held his empire together. German states that had reluctantly served France now rushed to join the coalition. The Rhine River, which had protected France for 20 years, no longer seemed like a barrier. As Napoleon's battered army limped back toward France, the coalition armies prepared to follow. The Battle of Nations, as Leipzig became known, had broken the back of the French Empire. The eagle that had soared over Europe was falling, and nothing could stop the Allied advance toward Paris itself. Part 3. Paris falls and the Emperor abdicates. By early 1814, the Allied armies had crossed the Rhine and marched deep into French territory. Russian Cossacks rode through villages that had not seen foreign soldiers in decades. Austrian and Prussian troops pressed forward with grim determination. The French people, exhausted by 20 years of war, watched these foreign armies with weary resignation rather than fierce resistance. Napoleon fought desperately to defend his homeland. He displayed flashes of his old genius, winning small victories against separated enemy forces. But he faced impossible odds. For every French soldier, the Allies had 3 or 4. His marshals, once eager for glory, now whispered about peace. The treasury was empty. French mothers had given too many sons to his wars. Paris became the key to everything. The Allied commanders knew that capturing the capital would break French morale completely. As their armies approached the city, panic spread through the streets. Government officials packed their belongings. Wealthy citizens fled south. The common people barricaded their shops and waited. On March 30th, 1814, Allied troops fought French defenders at the gates of Paris. The battle lasted through the night. By dawn, foreign cannons thundered in the suburbs. The city's defenders, vastly outnumbered, could not hold their positions. White flags appeared on the walls of Paris. The unthinkable had happened. The capital of Napoleon's empire had fallen. Inside the city, Napoleon's greatest betrayal unfolded. Talleyrand, his foreign minister, secretly negotiated with the Allies. This cunning diplomat had served every French government since the Revolution. Now, he worked to remove his emperor. Other officials joined this conspiracy. They believed France needed peace more than it needed Napoleon. The Allied leaders offered terms. Napoleon could keep his title and rule the small island of Elba off the Italian coast. He would receive a pension and a tiny army of guards. In exchange, he must give up all claims to France and Europe. His wife and son could visit, but not live with him. Facing complete military collapse and abandoned by his closest advisors, Napoleon signed the abdication papers on April 6, 1814. The man who had crowned himself Emperor of the French, who had made kings tremble across Europe, now signed away his throne with a simple signature. The Bourbon monarchy returned to France under Louis XVIII. The Allies restored the old borders and sought to erase 25 years of revolutionary change. But they could not erase the ideas Napoleon had spread: nationalism, legal equality, and merit-based advancement. These concepts had taken root across Europe. As Napoleon sailed to his island prison, he surely wondered if this truly marked the end. The eagle had fallen, but eagles were known to soar again. Europe celebrated peace, but the question remained whether this peace would last or merely pause before the next storm. Part 4. The 100 Days and the Return of the Eagle. The sound of boots on cobblestones echoed through the French port of Fréjus on March 1, 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte stepped onto French soil after 10 months of exile on the tiny island of Elba. With just over 1,000 loyal soldiers, he began what seemed an impossible gamble. The former emperor who once commanded half of Europe now faced a kingdom that had supposedly forgotten him. News of the escape spread like wildfire across Europe. In Vienna, the great powers were reshaping the continent at their Grand Congress. The message struck them like lightning. The eagle had broken free from his cage. Panic seized the royal courts. They had celebrated too early, believing Napoleon was finished forever. But France was not the same country Napoleon had left. King Louis XVIII ruled with little popular support. The old nobility had returned, demanding their lost estates. Veterans of the Grande Armée found themselves forgotten, their pensions cut, their pride wounded. The revolutionary spirit still burned in many hearts, waiting for the right spark. As Napoleon marched north toward Paris, something extraordinary happened. Regiment after regiment sent to stop him instead joined his ranks. Near Grenoble, soldiers aimed their muskets at their former emperor. Napoleon walked directly toward them, opened his coat, and declared, "If any of you wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers dropped their weapons and cheered. Marshal Ney, who had promised King Louis he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, instead fell to his knees before his old commander. Within 20 days, Napoleon entered Paris without firing a shot. King Louis XVIII fled to Belgium in the middle of the night. The tricolor flag replaced the white banner of the Bourbons. Veterans danced in the streets while priests and nobles packed their belongings. The impossible had happened. Napoleon ruled France again. But Europe would not accept this resurrection. The Congress of Vienna declared Napoleon an outlaw and enemy of peace. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia mobilized massive armies. Nearly 1 million soldiers prepared to march against France. The Duke of Wellington commanded British and Dutch forces in Belgium. Prussian General Blücher gathered his veteran troops nearby. Napoleon knew he had little time. His only chance was to strike fast, defeat his enemies separately before they could unite their overwhelming numbers. The fate of his empire, his dynasty, and his legend would be decided in the fields of Belgium. The 100 days of his return were running out, and everything would depend on the battles ahead. Part 5. Waterloo. The empire ends in mud and rain. Napoleon moved first, striking north into Belgium in mid-June 1815. His plan was simple but bold: catch Wellington and Blücher before they could join forces. With 125,000 men, he would destroy each army separately. On June 16th, he divided his forces. Marshal Ney attacked Wellington's advance guard at Quatre Bras, while Napoleon himself struck Blücher's Prussians at Ligny. The battle at Ligny went Napoleon's way. His artillery pounded the Prussian squares, and his veterans charged through the village streets. Blücher's horse fell on him during the fighting, nearly crushing the old general. The Prussians retreated, bloodied but not broken. Napoleon believed he had knocked them out of the war for days. Meanwhile, Ney failed to break through at Quatre Bras. Wellington's British squares held firm against repeated cavalry charges. The Duke pulled his army back to a ridge near Waterloo village, a position he had studied months before. The ridge would give his men cover from Napoleon's deadly cannons. June 18th dawned gray and wet. Heavy rain had turned the Belgian fields into thick mud. Napoleon delayed his attack until the ground dried, giving his artillery better conditions. This decision cost him precious hours. Every minute allowed the Prussians more time to recover and march toward the sound of guns. At 11:30 a.m., Napoleon's cannons opened fire. 80 guns thundered against Wellington's ridge. The Duke had positioned most of his troops on the reverse slope, protecting them from the worst of the bombardment. French infantry columns advanced through the mud, their boots heavy with Belgian clay. The first attacks failed. British musket volleys shattered the French columns. Wellington's men formed squares when Napoleon's cavalry charged, presenting walls of bayonets that horses would not cross. Marshal Ney led charge after charge, losing thousands of men and horses. Napoleon's biggest mistake came in the afternoon. He sent his elite Imperial Guard against Wellington's center, believing one final push would break the British line. These veterans had never been defeated in battle. But as they climbed the muddy slope, Wellington's Hidden Guards Brigade rose from the grass and fired a devastating volley. The sight of the Imperial Guard retreating broke French morale. Across the battlefield, men who had fought from Egypt to Moscow began to flee. Wellington waved his hat forward, signaling a general advance. At that same moment, Blücher's Prussians arrived on Napoleon's right flank. The Emperor's army collapsed into chaos. Napoleon tried to rally his men, but failed. His carriage, his treasure, even his hat fell into enemy hands. The man who had conquered most of Europe fled the field in a common cart. 4 days later, he abdicated for the second time. This time, there would be no return from exile. The British sent him to St. Helena, a tiny island in the South Atlantic. The Napoleonic era had ended in the mud of Waterloo, closing 23 years of almost constant European warfare. Chapter 5, Epilogue, The Shadow of the Emperor, From St. Helena to Immortality. Part 1, Exile and Reflection on St. Helena. The rocky shores of St. Helena rose from the South Atlantic like a natural prison, 1,600 miles from the nearest land. On this remote speck of British territory, the man who once commanded armies across continents found himself confined to a handful of square miles. Napoleon Bonaparte, former Emperor of the French, arrived in October 1815 aboard the HMS Northumberland, watching his final destination grow larger through the ship's windows. The island's governor, Hudson Lowe, made clear that this exile would be different from Elba. No comfortable palace awaited Napoleon here. Only Longwood House, a damp and poorly ventilated building that had previously served as a barn for the island's livestock. The British allocated him a small household staff and a meager allowance, treating him not as a fallen emperor, but as a dangerous prisoner who must be watched constantly. Days stretched endlessly for the man who had once dictated the fate of nations. Napoleon rose late, often remaining in his dressing gown until afternoon. He paced the cramped rooms of Longwood, his hands clasped behind his back in the familiar gesture that had once preceded great decisions. The Atlantic winds rattled the windows as he stared out at the barren landscape, perhaps remembering the view from the Tuileries Palace or the camps where his Grande Armée had gathered before marching to glory. Writing became his refuge and his weapon. Napoleon began crafting his memoirs, not merely to record events, but to shape how history would remember him. He spoke for hours to his companions, particularly General Bertrand and Count Las Cases, who transcribed his words. These sessions were performances as much as recollections, with Napoleon casting himself as the champion of liberty betrayed by lesser men. Through his correspondence and dictated memoirs, Napoleon presented his version of events to the world. He portrayed his wars not as conquests, but as necessary defenses of revolutionary ideals against monarchical oppression. The Continental system became not economic warfare, but an attempt to create European unity. His reign appeared in these accounts as a golden age of progress and enlightenment, cut short by the jealousy of foreign powers. The conditions of his captivity grew increasingly bitter. Disputes with Governor Low over protocol and privileges consumed Napoleon's energy. He refused to acknowledge his captor's authority, insisting on being addressed as emperor rather than General Bonaparte. These petty battles over dignity became daily torture for a man accustomed to absolute respect. Napoleon's health began declining in 1820, his body succumbing to the damp climate and restricted conditions. Stomach pains racked him, but he continued his literary campaign to secure his legacy. Even as death approached in May 1821, he remained focused on how posterity would judge his extraordinary life. His final exile had become his last battlefield, fought not with cannons, but with carefully chosen words designed to ensure his legend would outlive his captors. Part 2. The Dismantling of the Empire. Even as Napoleon lay dying on his remote island prison, the victorious powers of Europe had already begun their monumental task of erasing his revolutionary changes. In Vienna, diplomats from Austria, Britain, Prussia, and Russia gathered around polished tables to redraw the map of Europe. They worked methodically, like surgeons removing a tumor, cutting away every trace of Napoleon's continental system. The Congress of Vienna became history's greatest restoration project. Prince Metternich of Austria led the charge, determined to return Europe to its old monarchical ways. The diplomats restored kings to thrones that Napoleon had swept away. The Bourbon monarchy returned to France under Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI. Spanish Bourbons reclaimed their throne. Italian duchies went back to their former rulers, as if the past 20 years had been merely a bad dream. These men feared Napoleon's ideas more than they had feared his armies. The concepts of legal equality, merit-based advancement, and national self-determination had infected European minds like wildfire. Common people had tasted power and dignity under Napoleon's rule. Working-class soldiers had become marshals. Peasants had owned land. Jews had gained citizenship. The old aristocrats knew that simply defeating Napoleon would not kill these dangerous notions. France suffered the harshest treatment. The victors forced massive war payments that drained the treasury. Foreign armies occupied French soil until every franc was paid. They dismantled Napoleon's efficient administrative system, replacing competent officials with returned nobles who had learned nothing during their exile. The Code Napoleon survived, but barely, as royalist lawyers tried to restore aristocratic privileges. In the German states, the restoration proved more complex. Napoleon had consolidated hundreds of tiny kingdoms into manageable units. The Congress could not completely reverse this modernization, but they restored many displaced princes to smaller territories. The result was a confusing patchwork that satisfied no one fully. Italy faced similar fragmentation. The Kingdom of Italy dissolved back into separate duchies and papal states. Austrian control returned to the north, while the Bourbon Kingdom of Naples reclaimed the south. Italian patriots who had fought for Napoleon found themselves branded as dangerous revolutionaries. Yet, the restoration contained fatal flaws. Too many people had experienced Napoleon's reforms to accept their complete removal. Soldiers who had marched across Europe could not forget the brotherhood they had felt under the tricolor flag. Merchants missed the efficiency of unified legal codes. Students remembered when talent mattered more than birth. The Congress of Vienna created a Europe held together by fear rather than natural bonds. They had removed Napoleon's body from the European stage, but his spirit haunted every royal palace and government office. The restored monarchs would spend the next decades fighting the very ideas that Napoleon had planted in European soil, ideas that would eventually bloom into the revolutions of 1848. Part 3. The legend endures. Death arrived quietly on St. Helena in May 1821, but the emperor's passing marked only the beginning of his most powerful conquest. Within hours of Napoleon's final breath, the process of transformation began. The man who had terrified kings became something far more dangerous to their restored thrones, a symbol that could never be captured or executed. The French people, exhausted by war and defeat, discovered an unexpected hunger for their fallen emperor's memory. Veterans gathered in taverns to share stories of Austerlitz and Jena, each telling growing more magnificent with repetition. Peasants who had cursed conscription now spoke proudly of sons who served the Grande Armée. Bonaparte the tyrant faded, while Napoleon the legend took his place in French hearts. Artists across Europe found inspiration in the emperor's dramatic rise and fall. Writers transformed his story into romantic tragedy, painting him as a genius crushed by lesser men. Lord Byron wrote verses celebrating Napoleon's greatness, while Beethoven, despite his earlier disillusionment, acknowledged the emperor's role in spreading revolutionary ideals across the continent. Painters created images of Napoleon crossing the Alps or contemplating at Fontainebleau, each canvas adding layers to the growing myth. Young revolutionaries from Poland to Italy adopted Napoleon as their patron saint. They wore his symbol, the bee, as secret badges of resistance against restored monarchies. Students in German universities debated his reforms while plotting their own uprisings. The Code Napoleon became more than law. It represented the possibility of merit over birthright, reason over tradition. The restored Bourbon kings made a crucial mistake by trying to erase Napoleon's legacy completely. Their attempts to remove his eagles from public buildings and ban his symbols only made him more attractive to those who felt oppressed by the old regime's return. Every harsh measure against Napoleonic veterans created new martyrs for the legend. Louis Philippe understood this power when he claimed the throne in 1830. He deliberately associated himself with Napoleonic glory, decorating the Arc de Triomphe with scenes from the emperor's campaigns and planning the return of Napoleon's remains to Paris. The July monarchy discovered that embracing the legend provided legitimacy that mere royal blood could not supply. By the 1840s, Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon, recognized how completely the emperor's memory had captured French imagination. The legend had grown beyond historical fact into national mythology. Napoleon represented French greatness, revolutionary progress, and the dream that ordinary men could reshape the world through will and talent. The emperor's physical tomb in Paris became a shrine, but his real monument existed in the minds of Europeans who refused to accept that progress had died with him. The restored monarchs had won the battle against Napoleon the man, but they were losing the war against Napoleon the idea. His legend would soon produce another Bonaparte president, then emperor, proving that some defeats create more lasting victories than any military triumph. Part 4. Europe Transformed. Across the territories where Napoleon's armies once marched, permanent changes had already taken root that no Congress or restoration could fully reverse. The emperor's legal framework, centered on his famous civil code, continued to govern daily life in France and dozens of other nations. Citizens who had tasted equality before the law refused to surrender these rights, even as old aristocrats reclaimed their palaces. The Napoleonic Code became Europe's legal foundation. Its clear language replaced feudal traditions with modern principles of property rights, civil marriage, and religious tolerance. Belgium, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, and Italy maintained versions of this legal system long after French troops departed. Even Britain, Napoleon's greatest enemy, quietly adopted similar reforms in response to changing times. More dangerous for Europe's restored monarchs was the seed of nationalism that Napoleonic rule had planted. When French administrators imposed uniform laws, taxes, and languages across conquered territories, they accidentally taught people to think of themselves as distinct nations. Germans began imagining a unified Germany. Italians dreamed of a single Italy. These ideas terrified kings who ruled over patchwork empires held together by dynastic marriages and ancient treaties. The old diplomatic balance that had maintained European stability for centuries lay in ruins. The Congress of Vienna tried to recreate the past, but the new forces were too strong. Secret societies spread revolutionary ideas across borders. University students formed nationalist clubs. Veterans of Napoleon's armies carried stories of glory and brotherhood that inspired younger generations. Economic changes proved equally lasting. The Continental system had forced European manufacturers to develop local industries independent of British goods. These new factories and trade networks survived Napoleon's defeat, creating a more competitive European economy. The middle class that profited from these enterprises demanded political rights to match their growing wealth and influence. Education systems established under French rule continued producing literate citizens who read newspapers, formed political opinions, and questioned traditional authority. The emperor's emphasis on merit over birth had created new social mobility that proved impossible to reverse completely. Perhaps most significantly, Napoleon had demonstrated that rapid, total change was possible. He had shown that ancient institutions could fall overnight, that new nations could be born from imperial decree, and that common soldiers could become kings. This knowledge would fuel revolutionary movements throughout the 19th century. The restored monarchs sensed their vulnerability. They formed the Holy Alliance, pledged to support each other against revolution, and tried to suppress dangerous ideas through censorship and police surveillance. Yet every attempt to silence Napoleon's legacy only proved its continued power. When revolts erupted across Europe in 1848, protesters carried tricolor flags and sang songs from the imperial era. The emperor's nephew would soon ride this continuing wave of Napoleonic nostalgia to power in France, proving that some ideas become stronger through defeat than victory ever could have made them.